This installment in the series on Nephilim for the RPG Game Learning Group is now moving into part 2, a section called Incarnation, and this is the system chapter. It starts open with more fiction. Our example character has really gotten into trouble as being hunted by Templars with an alchemical dog, and he's trying to find a secret hiding place that he vaguely remembers from 400 years ago where he escaped similar pursuers. And wounded, he's not sure he's going to make it. So that's pretty thrilling. And that, of course, sets us up for the game system information. So from page 90 to... where does it end? 90 is a very short section. So 90 to 93 is system information. And then we get into the skills, how they are, or what they represent. Criticals and fumbles are dealt with in there. Experience is dealt with in that section. And then we have the long list of definitions of skills. That takes us up to page 102, which then brings us to a very interesting section called potentials. And this is something that, if not an addition, is a really important part of BRP, which is very much overlooked. Like, you won't find it easily flipping through the big gold book, and you won't find it easily going through pretty much any version of Call of Cthulhu. Yet it's a very obvious in hindsight application of the system, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Then we get to the combat section on page 108, which goes up to injury on 114, which then brings us into the system for reincarnation on 116, and then we focus more on experience and then get into Agartha, and that ends part 2. So it's a fairly meaty but fairly short section from page 90 to page 124. Game system opens looking at time, and there are some games that never really mention the elasticity of time, like the game master and the group are able to zoom in on time or shrink it down. There are some that are written like, a round is 6 seconds long, and it feels like you need to play every moment of the game session in real time somehow. So that's handy. And then there's a brief discussion of skill time, like how long should a roll for a given type of skill in a specific situation, like stress or no stress, take. So that's good. Then there's a discussion of movement, which oddly is written from the point of view of regular miniatures play, which, around the time this was written was not standard practice for play. And, for most of the BRP that I've ever played, it's not really been a part of it either. So it's interesting that it would be written from the point of view of if you choose not to use miniatures, because there really aren't any rules for miniatures provided. It then describes characteristics, the range. If you have a 3 in a characteristic, or if you have an 18 in a characteristic, what's the range that's represented? I'm not a big fan, actually, of how the lower end of these scores is described, but it does give you a very clear picture. It then moves from that description of what the characteristics are into the first piece of system, which is characteristic dice rolls. This is where you take the raw score of the characteristic and you would multiply it to turn it into a percent. In Nephilim, the percent by which a characteristic is multiplied is presented as a range from 0.5 for the almost impossible tasks up to 5 for simple. Now, in earlier versions of BRP, such as you'd find in the early Call of Cthulhu, or in the Worlds of Wonder supplements, Magic World or Super World, that sort of thing, mostly what is focused on for presenting the characteristic rolls are the idea roll, the agility roll, the know roll for the knowledge roll for Call of Cthulhu, and luck. So these are multiplied on your character sheet at the ×5 level. So like power times 5 equals luck, for example. And that's really all that was discussed. Now, the characteristic roll is for those situations where there is no directly applicable skill, but the source of action is still the character doing something or some intrinsic value related to the character being responsible for action. Resisting poison, for example, comes to mind easily. What skill allows you to stand there and not be poisoned? Well, obviously, nothing. So your constitution comes into play, and how virulent is the poison. But basic role-playing also offers another option in these situations, and this is also presented in this section. This is the resistance table. If you haven't experienced the resistance table, its purpose is to compare two different traits. Now, this is not something active so much as a skill. Like, you don't put skills versus other skills on the resistance table, although you could, but that wasn't its purpose originally anyway. But let's say a character has to pick up a heavy object. Now, in some games, you might have, a strength of 15 enables an investigator to lift this much weight. But as anybody who's ever had to move house knows, sometimes it's not always just the weight. It's the unwieldiness of an object or its lack of, something to grip. And so we bring in the idea of the resistance table. So that character with the strength of 15 might be pitted against an object with a size of 12 or whatever number. We have an active characteristic and we have a passive characteristic. What the resistance table simply does is allow you to reference those two characteristics and find very, very quickly a percentage chance that fairly pits those things against each other. Characteristic roll is used in a situation where there might not be an obvious answer as to what that resisting characteristic is. In basic role play, poisons have potency. So the potency versus the character's constitution on the resistance table, this works very well. However, we could also apply a difficulty to resisting poison. Say that this is an almost impossible poison to resist, therefore multiplying the constitution characteristic by half. Or we could say it's a normally difficult poison. So the characteristic ×3 would cover that, and the player simply rolls. What I like about all of these is that these days, in modern times, systems like this are referred to as player-facing, meaning that the person doing all of the rolling for all of this is the player. You orient or you frame the roll so that the action, the tension, the dice roll is being passed to the player. Do you have the constitution to survive the potency of the poison? Do you have the strength to lift the dead weight of the object? That sort of thing. So that's interesting. Not always written with that concept in mind, though. I doubt that concept was one that was discussed to the point of view where it actually became a rule of design at this early point. But it, in play, tends to work out that way. I know the numbers won't be clear, but this is the resistance table. If we access the active characteristic along the top and the passive characteristic up and down along the side, we find where they intersect. Now, the same number cross-referenced with itself will give you 50%. Now, if we take our 15 in strength versus a size of 12 and then read across to the active characteristic, we'll get a percentage of 65%. 15 over 12. And that 65% is what the player would roll in order to see if they can actually lift that thing. Outside of the range, to the bottom of the chart, failure is assured. The top of the chart, outside of the range, success is certain. Since the beginning of BRP, in all of its different guises and games and incarnations, the characteristic roll and the resistance table have been presented together, and although there have been varying levels of detail to go along with that, based on page count and the like, they've both been offered as a tool. Characteristic roll for when there really isn't an obvious thing against which to pit the character. Rather, it's just simply difficulty with no obvious skill to use. And the resistance table when there are two clearly definable traits, let's say strength versus size, or potency and constitution. The resistance table is about resistance. The characteristic roll is about overcoming difficulty. So these two tools have been presented since the dawn of the basic role-playing system in all its incarnations. Well, until now. And it kind of makes me sad to think that the resistance table is well and truly gone in the latest game in the BRP line. Call of Cthulhu 7th edition will not be including the resistance table. But this great old game, Nephilim, still has it. And you can make great use of it. And one of the most interesting applications of the resistance table and the characteristic roll is coming up next. Potentials. There's really a lot more to say about the empowering flexibility of the resistance table and other aspects like it in BRP, but before moving on to one aspect of that, this potentials I've mentioned, let's finish off the rest of this section. Hit points and actions are discussed. We already know this from doing character creation, so if you're interested in that, I'll refer you to that video. The damage bonus, the resistance table is described, and then we get into skills. The skills opens with a description of what skills are, what they represent in the game system, then specifically how they're dealt with in Nephilim. Because the Nephilim has their own skills, which they bring with them from incarnation to incarnation. And of course, the current host, the current simulacrum, has its own set of skills. And these are separate. The simulacrum no longer has the ability to advance in terms of experience, but the Nephilim does. And as it makes use of its host skills, it can start learning those skills, bringing them into its purview. So that's kind of interesting. It discusses criticals and fumbles. In this game, it's 10% for a critical, and a fumble is 99 or 100. It talks about skills going over 100%, mainly as a buffer versus modifiers, and as an interesting rule, which some may remember from earlier editions, where if modifiers reduce your skill below 100%, then your critical and fumble chance operates normally. If your skill remains over 100%, then criticals are more likely. This is now a 5th instead of a 10th, and you only fumble on the roll of 100. So something to keep in mind as you play. There's a lengthy discussion of automatic skill use, when to waive a roll, and what constitutes extraordinary circumstances. I don't think the extraordinary circumstances paragraph was written particularly well, as one of the 3 examples given is an example of normal, not extraordinary use. I think it's a case of period information from a game like Call of Cthulhu being imported into a modern game, citing helicopter piloting as extraordinary usage of skill, which would make perfect sense if you're playing in a far earlier period, but doesn't make a lot of sense in this one. It then talks about experience checks, and then gives us our long list of skill definitions, and then we get into something which sent me looking through all my VRP stuff today, looking for it in other books. I expected to find it in the big gold book, and it wasn't there, or at least I didn't find it. So if it is there, please leave a comment and let me know where in the book it is. It's not in Call of Cthulhu 4th edition, 5.6, 5, or 6, or 7th. Might be in 7th. Can't remember. All right. And what it's called is potentials. And this moves from the premise that you can't always be prepared for everything. And this stuff is pretty helpful. And this allows you to very quickly and yet fairly adjudicate the resources of a library that you hadn't given thought about before. And it's not, a library in the enemy's control, or a library that is connected in some way to what's been happening. A library whose contents This is a library which has every right to have some information in it that the players are looking for, and a chance for it not to have stuff. And rather than you just deciding on the spot, you can turn it over to the system to handle using potentials. And this is to assign a percentage chance to the potential for something to happen, for the police force to start putting clues together about mysterious occult thefts in the neighborhood, and possibly tying or being able to slowly work their way back to the simulacrum, or about how likely a given town is to have occult activity or secret society activity. That kind of thing. Potentials. It's described as a universal measuring stick, or a shorthand method of describing diverse things such as the potency of poison, an illness, the quality of medical care found in a community, the amount of banditry in a town, the authority level and efficiency of the police, and so on. Anything that you're not prepared for, that you can think, it's a small town, so it's about 7 out of 20, and then move from there to turn it into a percentage chance that the characters can then interact with. So I kind of like that section on potentials, and it actually goes on for quite a few pages. It talks about consequences. It gives examples of police response and severity. It talks about different types of crimes, particularly because these Nephilim may be in pursuit of specific occult material or tomes or artifacts that other people already own and are not interested in selling. And this is your eternal life and ascension that's on the line. Of course you might consider stealing it. And so how do you deal with the repercussions of all of that? The potential for leaving bits of evidence behind is here. Notes on how to resolve it. Notes on doing this with contacts, right? Your web of contacts. Using potentials to represent that. Forged documents, different relationships, getting in and out of jail. Then dealing with other people who are interested in the occult for various reasons, from bored teenagers to serious religion founding tax evaders and the like. So very important and very useful section that could be imported as a concept into a lot of other games, but in a modern game takes on a lot of real weight and utility, because their characters could simply hop on a plane and suddenly be in a new city, and you've only played for an hour, and all of your notes are about the other city. Well, now they're useless. But using this concept of potential, you can very quickly get something going. You live in the modern world. you know what to expect from a town, but rather than just relying on fiat, I say there's nothing to find here, and like a passive aggressive way to push them back to the original town, you can go with it and it'll be fair and has that little spark and joy of discovery for the game master, which is something that excites me quite a bit. On page 108, we get to the combat section, and if you've played any games in the BRP family before, there's a lot that's familiar here. Everything is organized in the round according to dex ranks, and so the game master counts down through, fastest dex going first. If two dexes are equal, it's considered simultaneous. You have an attack roll. The person who's being attacked can opt to parry, dodge, or try and use their armor. The roll to hit is really a roll to inflict damage. So how narration goes is not really about hit or miss. It's about actually connecting with a damaging blow. Parry is interrupting the attack. There are special rules for misses and fumbles. It describes what actions are, like how much should be declared, and how far you can move during one round of combat, that sort of thing. Disengaging, changing weapons, helpful stuff to get a sense of what's represented in this one count down through the dex ranks. There's a box for useful modifiers, a section dealing with special results, like if someone rolls a critical, dealing with knockout, how automatic weapons work, aiming, the use of sights on firearms, the different types of effectiveness of armor, and then outside of the injury section, it gets into the consequences of wounds. So I think it's well placed here. So dealing with stunning, blood loss, skill reduction, healing, unconsciousness, and death, this is all here. Then there's a Nephilim specific effect. Once the simulacrum has taken a certain amount of damage, down to 3 or fewer hit points, there's a chance that the Nephilim, because of all of this shock and trauma, will kind of lose its grip temporarily. And there's a roll to resist that. If it succeeds, it can keep the body moving, even though the body may have fallen unconscious as its possessing entity. If it fails, it's out, and so is the body. It has a box text damage dealing with the mysterious orichalca material, what it's like to be struck from it. Each blow from an orichalca weapon that draws blood, which means does at least 1 point of damage, permanently reduces a Nephilim's dominant Ka by 1d20 points. This is something to legitimately be terrified of in this game, right? Particularly if you have incarnated many times. 1d20. Right? So to flash back to the character creation video for a moment, the dominant Ka trait for a starting character before the player has started to assign points is capped at 22. For each incarnation, 2 points get deducted. So if you've only incarnated once, the time that the character is being played now, then you've got 20 or fewer points left in dominant Ka. And this weapon does 1d20 damage to the dominant Ka. Now in play, the Nephilim are in search for Agartha, and there are quite a few things that they need to do in order to attain that. One of those things is, of course, to increase the power of their Ka, to increase their dominant Ka, and they can do that through experience checks, much like everything else, although harder than raising skills. And the more Ka that they build, the harder it is for them to accrue more. And there are these weapons out there that will take it off in chunks, maybe as much as 20 at a time. And you think about, how cruel a D20 can be. This material, this type of weapon, and the people who wield it, they're definitely out to destroy the Nephilim, and they definitely have that capability in their hands. Be afraid. It talks about reincarnation here, then it gets into the weapons list and how they work, and that brings us on page 114 to injuries. It goes into wounds, acid, poison, drowning, and asphyxiation. Really, it's talking about sources of injury, types of injury. Explosions, falling, fire. It gives us the aging table. It gives us a table about sample poisons, right, with their symptoms, the potency, and the speed of onset. So that's very helpful. The next section on 116 deals with all the nuts and bolts for reincarnation. The death of the simulacrum, going back into stasis, changing stasis. What if the stasis item were destroyed? Narcosis, looking for another simulacrum. And this brings us into experience. So these 2-page sections, easy to find, easy to read, good, clear headers. So I quite like how this part was written. The opening section on the game system, parts of it were a little shaky, could have used more review, I feel, but this part is pretty solid. The Nephilim have a skill increase. The simulacrum doesn't. It talks about the simulacrum's experience, their skill training, studying with a teacher, characteristic increase, Ka element checks, Ka increase, and then it gets into alchemical experience and the progression of your metamorphosis. These last two being of primary importance in play. So there's a sample gain and loss of metamorphosis chart to deal with. So some acts gain points each time they're performed, and other acts lose metamorphosis points each time they are performed. And so we have this ebb and flow of your metamorphosis. The next section is Agartha. Now we've been talking about Agartha in the discussion in the RPG game learning group because it's presented in the fiction as being the reason why the Nephilim are doing anything at all. You know, what do they do with their immortality? Well, they seek Agartha. But from the player perspective, how important is this factor? There are some answers about Agartha in the Agartha section, but not all. The game at this point comes out and says that although this is the primary burning drive for the Nephilim character, that this should not be a player goal. The game is not about acting after you've achieved this state. It's very much about the pursuit of this state. But when you get your character to this level, it's time to consider playing another character. I find that interesting. It does provide good advice on how to portray Agarthan characters as NPCs from the GM side of the screen. Right? If in their travels the Nephilim make contact with such a character, what would they be like? And you certainly get enough information about what they would be like, what they can do, what from their perspective. And I like that they went this route. From the Agarthan's perspective, what is the world really like? And so that's handy. It explains what mechanically the Agarthan character can do. And in terms of playing Nephilim with that kind of character, it would not be a very challenging or very interesting game. And they suggest that maybe in a follow-up game, the point will be to play Agarthan characters in challenges of their own. And it implies what those challenges might be. This is not that game, so we won't really talk about that here. It then, in this section, says, well, what happens if in the quest to achieve Agartha you step wrong? And so it goes into degeneration. It goes into the shadow state, which talks about when the Nephilim loses control of its simulacrum and goes into kind of a coma within the character. The simulacrum regains control of its life and doesn't remember things that happened when the Nephilim was in control, but at the same time hears voices and has been affected by the experience. Or there is a state of madness, ultimate degeneration, wherein not only the mind of the Nephilim is affected, but the body of the simulacrum as well. And they might experience drastic physical changes such as gigantism or becoming ethereal and other things, which can be determined randomly. There's, of course, random tables. And how long does this madness last? This is where the game steps off into some interesting territory, as it says, well, really, the game master can just decide. Lean over, take the character sheet, I'll get back to you, is the advice given, and the sheet can be modified however the game master sees fit during this period of madness. I find some of that disturbing. But then again, it is a period of madness. So this would be something to talk about before play. Definitely. One of the risks that your character faces is a very detrimental state of madness, wherein they may change mentally or physically. They may run off and do things which cause them to learn or experience new things, or develop phobias or the like. So a pretty significant risk from the point of view of character, and not something that I would want to undertake with people who are overly attached maybe to their character concept and aren't willing yet, or not experienced yet, in the process of giving up that firm grip on that initial concept, but instead using it as a starting point for character growth, to experience, explore the character. Dangerous stuff. And that ends part 2. Part 3, which will follow in a later video, is called Initiation.